One of the greatest accessories to release for the GameCube was the Game Boy player. Having actual Game Boy hardware attached to the console and being able to access your library of handheld games to now play on the TV was honestly such an awesome experience back in the day. Heck, it still is. Now, the Game Boy Advance and GameCube both released the same year in 2001, and were essentially companion devices to complement each other. It was not uncommon for publishers to release Game Boy Advance versions of games that they were also releasing on the GameCube. In this episode, I've picked a handful of games to cover that are Game Boy Advance ports of their GameCube versions. Now, this won't be every Game Boy Advance game that released alongside the GameCube version, as there are a ton of them out there. Instead, this will be somewhat of a mini-series of videos that I'll cover throughout time on the channel. So, without further ado, let's check out some GBA ports of GameCube games. First up is 007 Nightfire, published by EA Games and developed by JV Games for the Game Boy Advance. Now, Nightfire is known for not only being a great Bond game, but also an excellent first-person shooter for the GameCube. This GBA conversion was an ambitious one, as I remember reading in magazines how the developers were trying to give a solid 3D FPS experience of the game itself onto a handheld. So, how does it fare? Well, it's actually pretty solid. At first it may seem jarring and the frame rate isn't quite smooth, but despite that, I found myself actually getting into this conversion. Controls do take some acclimating, but if you've played JV Games' previous release Backtrack, or even other FPSs on the GBA like X vs. Sever, it's about what you would expect control-wise. The visuals are okay, the character models are 2D sprites and the environments are in 3D, but like I said, the frame rate is quite low. Gameplay overall does its best to have you relive missions from the game itself with similar objectives, but obviously has shrunk down quite a bit. So for example, none of the vehicle or on-rail missions are found here. All things considered though, for a pared-back handheld version that tried to bring the console experience to the Game Boy Advance, it's still moderately fun. And sticking with the 007 theme, next up is 007 Everything or Nothing, which was published by EA Games and developed by Kryptonite Games for the Game Boy Advance. 007 Everything or Nothing is one of my favorite, if not favorite, 007 games ever made, bringing a level of production values that exceeded what we expected back in 2004. This Game Boy Advance port was actually released before the console version due to EA delaying the game a few more months for EA Redwood Shores, also known as Visceral Games later on, to further fine-tune the experience. That being said, the Game Boy Advance port follows the console version pretty loosely. Other than the opening mission, every mission for the most part is vastly different. In this isometric action game, players can choose to be stealthy to take out foes or go guns a-blazing. The game actually incorporates vehicle segments as well, which is very heavily inspired by the original Spy Hunter, except it's in an isometric camera angle instead of a top-down angle. The game actually plays quite well, with solid controls and engaging gameplay overall. The soundtrack does a good job of being dynamic as well, where the music picks up when a guard spots you and is a little bit more low-key as you keep trying to explore. It honestly looks and feels like a 007 game that would have just released on the SNES back in the day. Overall, it's a solid handheld version that serves as a fun alternative or companion, since it actually has GBA connectivity with the GameCube version, but I'll save that connectivity for another episode I have planned in the near future. Next up is Drome Racers, published by THQ and developed by Mobius Entertainment for the GBA, who later became known as Rockstar Leeds that made the GTA PSP games. Drome Racers is actually a LEGO property game which you race in the year 2015. Oh yeah, I remember when we had vehicles like that in 2015, don't you? Anyway, jokes aside, this is by far one of the best looking 3D Game Boy Advance games I've ever seen in action. While there's minimal texture work in the environments to help keep the frame rate smooth, it blew my mind that I was playing a GBA version of a console port. Heck, even critics back in the day praised this version as a far more impressive version, all things considered. The handling controls can be a bit tricky, trying to grasp turns without hitting walls, but other than this, it does control really well. There's a good sense of speed, and you can pick up weapons and boosts to use throughout races. Additionally, there's even a drag race mode, which changes the gameplay into first-person view. I will say, one thing I wasn't a fan of was that every race had the same song, but that may be the trade-off for the strong visual focus. From what I've played so far, this is definitely a hidden gem for the Game Boy Advance, and if you enjoy racing games, I highly recommend looking into this one. Next up is ESPN International Winter Sports 2002, published by Konami and developed by Konami Osaka for the Game Boy Advance. Alright, now International Winter Sports 2002 is a game I actually plan on reviewing for the GameCube very soon, but it is one I spent a ton of time with growing up. This GBA port provides a fairly authentic conversion of the home console experience, with a few events removed and in place a few events added. You still have events like K90 and K120 ski jumping, alpine skiing downhill, moguls, speed skating, figure skating, and snowboarding halfpipe. But they added in snowboard slalom in place of skiing slalom in the console version, luge in place of bobsleighing in the console version, and biathlon. Every game mode provides you with the controls before starting an event, and it will require utmost perfection if you want to nab a medal, or more impressively, beat a world record. I do like that the game went for a Mode 7 style in some of the events, and they actually did a good job translating that console experience on the handheld. If anything, it feels like another example of a game that would have released on the SNES back in the day. While rapidly button pressing your GBA in public may look kinda silly, there's still quite some fun to be had here if you're into these arcade style games. Next up is Freekstyle, published by DSi Games and EA Games, and developed by Full Fat for the Game Boy Advance. Freekstyle is a game I spent a ton of time with on the GameCube, and was an incredibly fun one overall. This port brings much of what the console version provided, but all in an isometric view. All the characters return here, and controls are actually pretty solid once you get the hang of it. Freekstyle is known for being a very over-the-top motocross game in the way SSX did for snowboarding. After all, it was part of the EA Sports big label. The GBA version does still give you a thrill of going off of insane jumps and pulling off tricks to fill up both your boost meter and freak meter. When the freak meter is full, you can pull off the character's special and go into freak out mode, where you can boost like mad, and doing more tricks will keep this going. I will say, what I also appreciate about this version is that they actually added even more levels that aren't available in the original console version. Visuals are nice and run really smooth, and the soundtrack is straight from the console version as well, with a very high quality sound. This is honestly not only a really good port of the GameCube version, but a hidden gem for the Game Boy Advance. Next up is Gauntlet Dark Legacy, published by Midway and developed by Pocket Studios for the Game Boy Advance. Now, the Gauntlet games are known for being great co-op experiences, and the series has seen its share of ports to various consoles over the years. With Dark Legacy on the Game Boy Advance, we have a port of the GameCube version that tries to bring the gameplay to the handheld as best as possible. Controls are responsive, and combat feels very similar to its console brother, and the isometric view is a perfect fit in this handheld version. So, it feels like Gauntlet, and it plays like Gauntlet, but it's missing one massive thing: multiplayer. Yeah, there is no multiplayer option in this Gauntlet. How did the developers omit this? Also, invisible walls. Yay. Another issue though is that levels are far too long for a handheld game. The first level took 10 minutes alone, and trying to figure out where to go while movement isn't quite fast enough feels kinda off-putting. That being said, I know it sounds like it's not great, but it's also not awful by any means from what I played. It just could have used a lot more refinement. But if you're a fan of Gauntlet Dark Legacy on the GameCube and wouldn't mind having a handheld version that's a little bit different, then I'd say go for it. Just be prepared to play it just by yourself. No co-op multiplayer. What were they thinking? Next up is SSX Tricky, published by EA Sports Big and developed by Visual Impact for the Game Boy Advance. SSX Tricky was one of my most played games early into the 6th gen, and truly cemented how much I love the snowboarding genre of games. This port that released a year later tried to bring the superb snowboarding title to the handheld and provided interesting results. In one aspect, the visuals are fairly impressive for the Game Boy Advance, with the game using 2D renders for the characters on screen, while the environment is all in 3D. It captures the aesthetics of the console big brother between the main menu UI and overall look, but the comparisons start to fade shortly after. Other than the start screen and loading screen music being from the console version, the music here is all original and a mixed bag. Some tunes are solid, and some are just head-scratchingly boring. Levels also tend to go on a bit longer than necessary at times. There are still the race and show-off event types, but races will feel monotonous since you need to complete 3 heats each to nab a medal. Some races take upwards to 5 minutes per run and can feel too prolonged in the process. Show-off remains the same more or less, but pulling off tricks in this game is far less responsive than the console version, and feels anything but tricky, more like stiffy. Quirks aside, it's an impressive port overall, but it just could have been better. And to keep things in line with the series, next up is SSX 3, published and developed by the same team as Tricky for the GBA. If you've been a fan of the channel for quite some time, you know that SSX 3 is one of my favorite games not only on the GameCube, but of all time. And if you need further validation as to why, I'll leave a card up above right now at this timestamp so that you can go back and check out that review. So, SSX 3 tries to build dramatically upon its predecessor, in which gone are the narrow linear courses and 2D character models, and replaced with much wider tracks and 3D character models. Instead of 3 peaks from the main console version, this one has been trimmed down to 2 peaks, but maintains a majority of the tracks combining all the peaks. However, what's here is one that tried to be possibly a bit too ambitious, as the frame rate is really poor. This is the trade-off with far more happening on screen. Controls have been smoothed out ironically a bit from the predecessor, but tricks still take some adjusting to pull off. There is more leniency with landing tricks though, and I think that's in part with just the geometry and the collision physics. The game also uses compressed versions of some of the tunes from the console version, and it sounds pretty good for the hardware. There's even voice samples for the characters here. Now, if you go into this expecting the quality of the masterpiece is based off of on consoles, you will be severely disappointed here. However, if you go into this as a fun alternative take, there is some enjoyment to be had. An impressive, if not overly ambitious port that would have ran significantly better on the DS hardware had it released a few years later. Next up is Spy Hunter on the Game Boy Advance, which was published and developed by Midway. Now, this is another game I loved during the 6th generation, and was the game that made me want a PlayStation 2 back in the day before getting a GameCube. When I saw the previews of the Game Boy Advance conversion in GamePro magazine back in the day, I was pretty excited for this. It was only a few years ago though that I finally got my hands on it, and I have to say, this is a solid port of a great game. Using Mode 7 visual techniques to the fullest, Spy Hunter provides players with a slimmer version of its console counterpart, but feels close to that experience. Driving through intense missions, taking down terrorists, and completing objectives littered throughout, you will handle the Interceptor both on land and over water, as it transforms from a car to a boat and vice versa on the fly. Visuals all run at a stable frame rate, and controls are very tight. I will say, this game can be quite challenging, but it is such a fun port that is a nice addition to the console version. Now, I just wish Spy Hunter 2 received a GBA port. Then again, I also wish Spy Hunter 2 had a GameCube port, since that stayed exclusive on the PS2 and Xbox. Next up is Smashing Drive, published by Namco and DSi Games, and developed by Raylight Studios for the Game Boy Advance. This studio, located in Naples, Italy, created an engine known as Blue Roses Technologies, which brought some of the most impressive looking 3D visuals that the Game Boy Advance could produce. Smashing Drive is, without question, one of the most impressive ports of a GameCube game to the Game Boy Advance, as it is a one-to-one conversion in a full 3D engine. This was always a guilty pleasure game for me on the GameCube, and even more so on the Game Boy Advance. While it is a game that can be beaten in about 30 minutes, it's perfect as a handheld game that is paced very well. Just like the console version, there are a ton of shortcuts to find in each area. Controls also feel tight and responsive without any issue in response time. While the soundtrack in the game was always this so bad it's good quality, there's something about this version that actually sounds better and slightly rearranged. While not the smoothest frame rate, it runs well enough for everything showing on screen, and it plays well too. It's such a superb port and technological achievement for the handheld version for sure. Fun fact though, Raylight Studios was also the team that pitched this Resident Evil 2 Game Boy Advance port to Capcom, who sadly turned it down. Not quite sure why, considering how impressive this even looked. Next up is Pac-Man World 2, which was published by Namco and developed by Full Fat for the Game Boy Advance. Pac-Man World 2 on the GameCube is one of my favorite 3D platformers for the console, and this GBA port actually translates into a 2.5D experience here on the handheld. The visuals here are very vibrant and catchy in the eyes, but don't let its charming aesthetics fool you. This game is very challenging due to platforming that'll result in numerous deaths. Pac-Man World 2 has you traversing fairly lengthy levels broken up into sections to reach the end goal, but will test your abilities. Pac-Man has the same moveset as he has in the console version, like his bounce jump and air flip kick, as well as his charging speed ability. I do like that this tries to be a 2D version of the 3D release with many of the same level themes, but I wasn't quite fond of the platforming itself. Some of the platforming just feels a bit off, and there's no shadow displayed when you're jumping on moving platforms, which can sometimes feel like a cheap death awaits whenever the time comes. Despite that though, I did somewhat enjoy my time with this one, it's just a little bit more infuriating at times. Next up is Dead to Rights, published by Namco and developed by Taurus Games for the GBA. Now, here is a game I always recommend to GameCube owners with its badass John Woo style action and really is a dime a dozen game for the console. With this Game Boy Advance port, players are provided a top-down view of the action now with much of what the console version brought. Hand-to-hand combat, guns a-blazing with lock-on mechanics, letting your canine friend Shadow out to pounce on foes, and of course, slow-mo diving. This is a stripped down port of the console version naturally, as it does shorten much of the game's levels here to fit the quick pick up and play nature of it. Visually, the game has a blend of vibrant colors, yet gritty tones within the cutscenes. Mechanics work well enough, but felt the gunplay was a little bit stiff here, even with the lock-on feature. Also, slow-mo diving feels less engaging here than in the console version, and before you say, well, it is a Game Boy Advance game so it has limitations, well, then do me a favor and look at Max Payne on the Game Boy Advance. Also, audio is pretty grating on the ears here, as all the gun effects are at the highest decibel possible, and with multiple guns going off, yeah, that got kind of irritating pretty quickly and did not immerse me any further. All that being said, what's here is still a solid, fun time, just lower the audio a bit. Next up is Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, which was published and developed by Midway for the Game Boy Advance. When Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance released on the 6th gen consoles, it was a pretty big deal. It radically changed the gameplay style from the originals and also had an opening that was jaw-dropping for fans of the series. Ported to the Game Boy Advance, I have to say this is a fairly impressive 3D fighter. Sure, it may not look as great nowadays, but for the Game Boy Advance on its size screen back then, this was pretty sweet to see in action. Gameplay is pretty responsive, with some combos and moves scaled back from the console version, but it still works very well. It is missing some of the characters from the console version, but more on that soon. The game also has the same music from the console counterpart, and it sounds quite rich despite being shorter loops of the tunes. The Crypt is also here with plenty of unlockables to keep you busy. And if that wasn't enough, I'm going to cheat by adding another version of the game released later, Mortal Kombat Tournament Edition. This release brought more characters that were missing from the Deadly Alliance GBA release, as well as returning characters. It also had different levels added, music tracks, and just more content overall. As far as Game Boy Advance fighters go, these were far better than the abysmal Mortal Kombat Advance, and honestly was just impressive in its own right.
Johnny Cage win. Fatality.
Next up is The Simpsons Road Rage, published by THQ and developed by Ultron for the Game Boy Advance. The Simpsons Road Rage was a really good Crazy Taxi clone that had all the humor from the show as well as the lore. In this GBA conversion, much of what the console version had is found here. Numerous characters to unlock and play as, all 6 locations from the console version, and even the mission mode is found here. The game utilizes Mode 7 as opposed to a 3D rendering engine, and it works quite well. The character models look really good and represent the characters from the show properly, and the game runs at a very smooth 60 frames per second with responsive controls as well. The maps are fairly big, and the game does a good job of showing you where to drop off passengers for their destinations. However, there can be times where you won't clearly tell if you can drive through a certain terrain due to the game having a less than effective distinction as to what determines a building wall or terrain that you can drive through off-road. Also, as much as I enjoy this game, the biggest issue I have with it is that it uses a password system instead of a battery save system, which feels like a chore if you're trying to keep up with progression in this game. That being said though, what's here is a great port of the GameCube version now on the handheld and is actually the only Simpsons game for the Game Boy Advance. And to wrap things up is Super Monkey Ball Jr., published by Sega and developed by Realism for the Game Boy Advance. Super Monkey Ball is one of my favorite GameCube games ever made, and for great reason. With its flawless gameplay and plethora of modes, it was an easy game to sink hours playing. With this handheld port, Super Monkey Ball Jr. brought us over 60 of the console version's 100 plus levels, as well as some of the mini games like Monkey Golf, Monkey Fight, and Monkey Bowling. Sadly, no Monkey Target though. Anyway, what is here is an incredibly impressive port that actually feels like Monkey Ball to a T. The 3D graphics engine used here works perfectly and flexes the Game Boy Advance's muscles to show it wasn't a slouch in the 3D visuals department if done right. This is such a faithful representation of the GameCube version that it is easily a must-own for fans of the game. The music all returns here as well, but is a bit more down-sampled and rearranged a bit here. This is also probably due to the developers prioritizing the visuals over the audio memory-wise. Regardless, easily one of my favorite GameCube to Game Boy Advance ports ever made.
Ready? Go!
Now, like I stated at the start of this video, this is far from all the Game Boy Advance ports of GameCube games, but rather a healthy handful of them. There are so many other games that fit this category, and I will save those for future episodes in this topic. The Game Boy Advance itself had one of the best libraries of games, and also one of the most extensive. So, have you played any of these games covered in today's episode? Any other Game Boy Advance ports of GameCube games that you played and enjoyed, or maybe didn't enjoy? Sound off in the comments below, as I'd love to hear your thoughts. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will catch you all in the next episode.